Do you hear that?
Pot. Yeah. Sounds like a coffee pot.
Sounds like
coffee somewhere.
Somebody's making tea.
Yeah. Welcome back to the Beyond the Wire podcast. I am your host, Tim Keller. Along with me is Mr. Matt Disher. And this week we have the Newtown Police Chief, Mr. Tom Synan. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. I asked before we started. I didn't want to mess it up at least too bad. So it's great to have you, sir. Happy Inauguration Day, everybody. Everybody take a deep breath. Relax.
Everybody settle down.
If your guy won, great. If your guy lost, it's okay. Let's not do anything dumb today. Let's be civil. Let's be a good American country and just move on. Everything's going to be okay. And guess what? In another 4 years, you'll get a chance to elect someone else if you'd like to. Please, for the love of God, let nothing dumb happen today. That's my wish for today. Matt, how are you doing? How are things?
No complaints. I'll add some flavor to that, and that is that we have a really short attention span in this country, and every 4 years we get another shot at this presidential thing. And then there's the mid-year elections that happen, every couple of years as well. So, it happens. It's cyclical. It goes back and forth. It has happened that way for as long as we can go back. So everything's good on my end. I've got a kid in quarantine. We're playing it safe. Otherwise, we're all healthy for the moment, and I have no complaints. I have complaints. Nobody's listening.
Oh, your poor wife.
Yeah, right.
She's forced to listen.
Right.
So as we like to do, we start off with some news from military.com, and the one article just popped right out at me because I had no idea we did this. But the article says Marines keep a stash of tanks fortified in Norwegian caves. It says for decades, the U.S. military has kept a stash of tanks, armored vehicles, and weapons arsenal fortified in caves in Norway. Anybody know anything about this?
I wonder if it's, there's two things that come to mind. When I was in boot camp, I kept a small stash of peanut butter packets in my rack because I was always hungry. Like they never fed me enough. And as you know, in boot camp at Parris Island, you're burning 1 million calories a day. So my thought was, I'm willing to get smoked on the quarterdeck. I'm willing to make them do.
You took that chance.
To do push-ups until I couldn't feel anything. I'm willing to do that in order to have some of this peanut butter get some extra calories in me. But in all honesty, I wonder if there's not more stuff like this. I bet you. I mean, you think about our military budget and just the legacy of the United States military. I bet you we have stashes of stuff all over the place. I realize that the Marine Corps is getting rid of its tanks, but I bet you that stash of tanks is there in case they got to call up those tankers one day in the event of World War III, in case somebody comes over the line in Europe,
Yeah. Tom, you were a Marine Corps veteran, is that correct?
Yeah. From 1986 to 90. I was a Dragon Gunner, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, which I don't even think that there's no more Dragons. They were switching to tows when I was in.
Yeah.
So I don't even know what it is nowadays.
Tows and javelins and SMAWs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And like Matt
like 1986, you're like, oh my God.
like Matt said, they're getting rid of the tanks. I don't know if they'll eventually introduce some new machinery, but they contract a company to build us some equipment. They use it all up, and then one day they're like, "Yeah, we're done using this." And then we have.
And those things are expensive. I mean, the tanks, the Abrams tanks, are just, massively expensive. And then you upgrade them, and I'm sure they upgraded the Marine Corps tanks in the last couple of years, and then said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to get rid of them."
Yeah.
So you've got millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in these.
We're done playing.
Right? We don't need these anymore. We're fine now. Well, and I read some books when I was in the Marine Corps. When I was deployed, and I couldn't tell you what these books were called, but I'm sure somebody might.
Dr. Seuss.
No. Too many words in Dr. Seuss. I couldn't put the rhymes together. They were the futuristic Marines that had like laser blasters and stuff like that. And I cannot remember the name of the books. But there was a series, and they were pretty decent books. But in that book series, the militaries no longer had tanks because they had such weapons to defeat them that tanks were no longer plausible in combat. If you think about it, even our first sweep through in Desert Storm in the early 90s, the Iraqi tank I mean, they had like the largest tank force on Earth, and they lasted 2 hours or something against our A-10s and our other equipment. So, I don't know. Maybe that's the route we're going, where the tanks are just. And I'm not trying to insult the Army, who has a ton of tanks, but I just wonder if it's gotten to that point where maybe it's less applicable in combat anymore.
They're probably not as agile and mobile as they need to be these days.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next news article I pulled up is a 6-part checklist to keep veterans motivated in the new year. And it just lists 6 different things that each of us can do. And it's not just for veterans. I think this is a good list for anybody. But number 1 is a great one. List what you can and cannot control. The things you can control, those are the things you're allowed to worry about because you actually have control over them. The things you cannot, put them over here. You can't do anything about it. So don't waste your time worrying about them. What's going to happen is going to happen. 2, write down what gives you energy. Again, things to focus on. Things that give you energy are things that are positive, and you need to continue to push for those things that give you energy. 3, ask yourself, who inspires you? The folks and the things that inspire you will lead to positive results. Number 4, celebrate every positive milestone. If you see what's happening here, they want you to focus on positive. They want you to focus on what inspires you. They want you to continue to push for positivity. 5, keep communicating. Obviously, we know that the big thing in the military and the veteran circle is the suicide rate. If you keep open lines of communication, especially with those you've served with or like-minded individuals, if you start feeling a certain way, most likely you're willing to reach out to somebody before you make a hasty decision. And then number 6, draw upon your skills of resilience. In case you find yourself, especially right now, we're almost a year into, some of these quarantines and lockdowns and things of that nature. People have that cabin fever that they normally do over winter. It's multiplied and magnified this year. Remember, we are all very resilient. Don't go out and do something rough to yourself. It's okay to feel these ways. If you focus on number 5 and communicate with somebody, focus on the positives, believe me, you'll get through this. So I thought that was a very good article.
It is a good article. I'd add to that, and maybe this summarizes some of it, but find what makes you happy. Go find a hobby. I think that's the big. I jokingly say this on social media when I see some of my friends who spend just abnormal amounts of time on Facebook complaining about things and arguing with people. I'm like, go get a hobby, like take up crocheting or go hike or something. Do something. I think we're in the day and age. And I think we've seen this. Exacerbated in the last couple of weeks, and in any political season, social media it can be a huge downer. You're locked in your house. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you have something else that's happened through this quarantine, through the COVID season, and you're looking at social media and it's doom and gloom, or it's the opposite of that. It's everybody's at Disney all the time and everybody's lives are great except for yours. And it's very easy to see the wrong side of life. It's very easy to take the wrong impression. And I always tell people, get off social media. I have largely limited myself on Facebook in the last month or so. Whenever things start to get ugly, whenever the conversations start to get really, just very political, I'm like, I'm out. I'm just done. I can't sit there and do it because it will drag me down. And I'm typically a pretty positive person, but find a hobby, go do something, look at the positive side of things and stop looking around for the bad news.
Yeah.
When you initially said that it was the motivating factors for veterans, I honestly, what came to mind was perhaps, piles of Kodiak and Copenhagen and then maybe bourbon and beer.
There you go.
Then I was like, no, that's not for veterans. That's for people who are active duty military. Those are the Marines in the barracks.
Copenhagen, Tabasco sauce, and the cheapest bourbon on the shelf.
Right. Yeah. But
it's what fuels the United States Marine Corps. Really.
Right. Rippets and Monsters.
Yeah.
And Red Bull. Yeah.
It's what keeps things moving. That's for sure.
Right.
All right. Well, let's talk to the chief. So, Tom, thank you very much for joining us today. It's great to have you. you have done some really amazing work in my opinion, a very important field of study, of interest, and sadly sometimes of heartbreak. So let's I'll let you have the floor here. Let's tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do?
Well, thanks for
Obviously, you're the chief.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm the police chief for the village of Newtown, which is about 11 miles east of downtown Cincinnati, a really small town. When I went to Milford High School as a little kid, went in the Marine Corps, barely survived boot camp, go through the Marine Corps, and I knew I wanted to be a cop, and that's why I went in the Marines. I didn't think I'd be able to get into college. I didn't think I'd have the money. I was smart enough, so going to Marine Corps thinking this would open up doors for policing, which it did. I mean, it was a long road. I worked in an even smaller town for about 2.5 years free. I was an auxiliary cop. I took one report there. It was funny. I was like 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm doing this report, and one of the other officers walks in and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, Mr. So-and-so had his pots and pans stolen. It's really weird that someone would steal pots and pans." And they go, "No, he has dementia." And I was like, "Oh, man." So in this small town, I never really took an actual theft report or any kind of report. But then I came to Newtown back in March 1st, 1993, and it was a whole different world, man. This little town is the coolest little town. I've got to experience life in it. I became police chief. And then what you're talking about with the addiction, it was not a road that I had planned on taking. I was traditional cop. I'd done drug work, undercover drug work, spent 10 years on SWAT, was a team leader on SWAT, doing all kinds of drug raids and all other kinds of police operations. And then I had realized that I'd seen the last of a brother, last of an entire family, literally. The mother and all three of her sons die from addiction. The mother from abusing prescription pills and alcohol. The youngest brother was shot and killed by crack cocaine. Oldest brother overdosed on heroin and fentanyl. And the last of the brothers, we had quite a unique relationship. He actually set my personal car on fire the first 6 months I was here.
Oh.
He was messed up. He thought it was another cop who had arrested him's car. Sets my car on fire. I dealt with him numerous times, burglaries, thefts, drugs, all kinds of stuff. And then when he died, he overdosed a couple weeks before Thanksgiving back in 2014. I got a call and they said they brought him back. And he was down here at the station. He was crying, saying he didn't want to die. So at the time, we didn't have a coalition. We didn't have a lot of resources, especially being a small town. So not knowing what to do, I said, well, we got to find help for him. We'll even pay for it if we can. Well, he ended up refusing help. And if you understand addiction a little bit, you start understanding that the fear of succeeding really is just as powerful as the familiarity of that despair. I mean, if you try to succeed, then you're held to that expectation. You have to live up to it. And when you fail, that's another notch on you. So understanding addiction better, I knew it would be a struggle for him, and he refused help. I said, we got to keep him alive for at least one more night, so let's take him to jail. We accomplished our mission, kept him alive for one more night. The next morning, he got out, did what was left of his heroin and fentanyl, and overdosed and died. I didn't realize the impact until later that night after he died, that it was quite emotional. And I was really surprised about how emotional it was. But it was really a big issue in a small town to lose an entire family, an entire generation to addiction. So I ended up writing an op-ed. I allowed myself to be very vulnerable, which from military experience, especially being in the Marine Corps, and then also a police officer, but a police chief, was quite the challenge to open up as much as I did. But that article, I tell people that article gave others permission to open up and tell their stories. And what it did for me was it allowed people to, I didn't understand how big of an issue this was until doctors, lawyers, veterans, police officers, firemen were saying, let me tell you my story of addiction, or let me tell you the story of my family and their addiction. And that really opened up the scope of, we need to do more about addiction. We need to speak up more. We need to stand up and change how we view and deal with addiction. And that led to me helping to form the Hamilton County, what was called a Heroin Coalition, now the Addiction Response Coalition. We started with 9 members. We have over 100 members, 40 different agencies. The White House, the Trump administration was down working with it, looking at it. It's actually a worldwide recognized coalition of community members working together. So from this tragedy of this family, we were able to do something positive that not only gave their lives meaning, but give lives of others meaning and give purpose for people working in it and the people that you're trying to help. So it is probably will be one of the most rewarding things that I've ever been a part of. It's up there with the Marine Corps, but I got to say the personal experiences and seeing the inspiration in people working to change how we view addiction, not just here in my local Cincinnati, but the United States and the world, has been pretty powerful.
You had I watched one of your TEDx or the TEDx talk from the University of Cincinnati. I don't know when that was from, a couple years ago.
It was February last year.
Last year, okay. So last year, before the whole world fell apart,
Right,
one of the things you mentioned in that conversation, I think one of the first things you said was that on your first day with Newtown, you heard a voice say, "You're going to change the world," or something along the line. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I walked into Little Newtown. I come from Terrace Park, where I took my one report that wasn't a report. I'm just out of the Marine Corps. I'm young, and I got a lot of confidence. And it was weird. I walked into the police department, and I shut the door, and I'm standing in the foyer, and I just stopped, and I heard this voice say, "This is where you're going to change the world." And literally, from that day on, was my mission. And I had no clue. When you hear that voice, it doesn't tell you this is how you're going to do it. This is what's going to happen 2 years down the road. You just got to believe in that. Okay, here's something that's driving me. This is my purpose. I've been given a mission. I don't know what my mission is in the end, but I'm going to have faith. I'm going to keep that faith, and I'm going to work towards it. And that day, I never looked at this being a small town. It was, yeah, I can impact as a patrolman. I can impact 1 or 2 people's lives. But if I get promoted to sergeant, now I got some people that I work with under me that they can impact people. So now it's 20 or 30. If I become a lieutenant on the department, now I can start making policies, influence the entire department. And I thought if I become chief, I literally can not only influence my department, but my community. And that would progress into the county, the state, the country, and the world. And I think that voice, that's what it kind of gave me direction of. One, you said it, Tim, is resilience was one of the biggest things that you need, not only in this job, but life. And in order to keep that faith and in order to keep that mission, you got to have that resilience to keep going. But that voice allowed me to think bigger. It allowed me to understand that my actions have a domino effect. I could be negative, and that will still be a domino effect, but it's going to have repercussions on other people. Mm-hmm. Or I can be a positive influence, and that positivity will do the same thing. It'll have repercussions on others. So I wanted this job a little bit different than most. I knew there was going to be bad experiences. I knew there was going to be things I struggled with, but I always felt that if I went through the grief, if I walked through it, in the end, there would be a positive out of it, and then I could use that as a domino effect. And that's what happened with the family. Like I said, I was caught off guard. Man, I did not start this job thinking I'm going to start a movement on addiction. Farthest thing from my mind. I did not think I'd get emotional watching a family die. We still deal with the kids. The grandparents are raising 5 of the kids. 3 of them are addicted. I never imagined that we would see 3 generations of addiction. This was a small town. It was supposed to be quiet and nothing happening. So I went down a path that I didn't anticipate, but it all started from that first time I walked through the front door. And if I was going to change the world, or if you're going to change the world, I'm going to tell you this: you're not changing the world because things are good. There's something bad, and you have to go through that bad, and you have to be vulnerable enough to tell other people what that bad is. And sometimes you have to stand on your own, and you got to speak out. But I promise you, when you stand out and speak on your own, others eventually will start coming along and following you. And when that happens, then that's when the movement starts changing.
Yeah, that was a really powerful video. And when we post the podcast up, we'll share the link to that YouTube video for your TEDx talk. Another part of that video, and just kind of going along with what you just said now, you have your bad days. You can lead with that negative, and there's going to be that trickle down effect. You can lead with positivity. In the video, you talk about leading with humanity. You mentioned about writing that op-ed, being as vulnerable as you were, having to make that decision. Am I going to put myself out there like this and be vulnerable and allow myself to be, judged and kind of maybe put in an arm's distance, especially in the field you work in? It's not necessarily not the right things, the wrong phrasing, but it's not the normal thing you find people doing in your line of work, sharing opinions and vulnerability. So you knew by sending that you were putting yourself out there to judgment. And in that moment, you said you went with your humility, because that's that's really what's going to lead the change, is the humility side of things, and being a human over than being that just you didn't allow yourself to just be defined by your role as a police officer or police chief, and that's awesome.
You think about the Marine Corps and policing, it's very traditional oriented. And not that I'm opposed to tradition. I love the tradition. I love the structure. But part of this too is you gotta think outside of that too. And what can you impact by just being a human being? A lot of times we all judge people. I'm judged because of a uniform, and they automatically think of me a certain way.
Mhm.
And also I think it is probably one of the things that harm us as police officers the most is we let this dictate to the world
Mhm.
what we are. But in reality, we're human beings, man. We feel it just like everybody. It's just like in the Marine Corps, Army, military. You have this uniform, but the uniform is your job. It is how you're fulfilling your mission. But inside is the human part. And I think if we lead with our humanity more often, one, we won't have as much conflict. But two, you get empathy. And I know when you talk about words like vulnerable and empathy, people go weak. I disagree. If you can show empathy and if you can show vulnerability, to me, you're one of the strongest people in the world.
Right.
The people I have some of the most respect for are those in recovery of addiction. Because you got to think about this. If you get in recovery, number one, you have to struggle with the physical and emotional stuff internally. But then you gotta live up to this judgment. People will judge you, and they're judging you constantly, and they automatically put the stigma on you. But then you have to tell the world your sins. I love when people in recovery stand on a stage in a group of people. Imagine, could you stand in front of a group of people and just air out your sins? Most people
It'd be
couldn't.
rough. Yeah.
Yeah, but what are we all striving for as human beings? We're really striving for that courage to be able to be us.
Mhm.
And those in recovery, to me, are the people who have found themselves because they stand up, they tell their stories, they tell their sins, they're willing to be judged. In the end, they have nothing left but honesty. Could you imagine living your life with pure honesty? To me, that would be the ultimate. I'm not even there. I can't accomplish it.
Yeah.
There's things that you do that just it's hard to tell people that this is my sin. And for them to do that, man, I have a lot of respect for them. But I wouldn't have got to that point if I wouldn't have led with humanity first. If I would have just led with the uniform, I would have automatically judged them as a criminal. You're just a drug addict. And we were talking before. The other thing you have to think about is when you're doing that in a stigma, there's a family attached to that person. It's never just the one that's impacted. And that's where that empathy and vulnerability comes in. Like I said, when I wrote that op-ed, I was stunned by it was hundreds of people, judges, lawyers, every profession saying, this is how addiction has impacted my life. And because of that, I was able to get a really good view of what this is really about and tell people. I've been given this platform and I have this ability to tell people, here's what addiction is. It never impacts the one, it always impacts the many. And when you go back to the military, Army, Marine Corps, whatever it is, what are we doing this for? We're doing it to help other people. We're doing it because it's something bigger than us, because our sacrifice will allow other people to be better.
Absolutely.
I've always found that my friends in law enforcement are, despite sometimes the tough exterior, because that's part of the job, are some of the most thoughtful people in the world, because you have so much perspective. And I think a couple of things, and this will lead into a question I'm going to ask you later on, but you've seen that addiction in this case is not specific to certain neighborhoods. It's not specific to certain income levels. It's not specific. I mean, it affects everybody. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't matter the race, color, your money. I mean, look at this. Prince was impacted by it.
Right.
You know, the kid, 18-year-old kid that sells the drugs on the street, he's impacted by it or she's impacted by it. A family's impacted by it. Matt, that's a good point, because I think it was the most striking to me was as a cop who did drug work, who did search warrants, who was on SWAT, you get focused on this is what drugs are. But watching that family die and then writing that op-ed and getting the feedback from others, it really opened up my scope. And I said, wait a minute, no, this is not addiction. Addiction impacts anybody. That's one of the things I loved about the Marine Corps. Here you are, 18, 19 years old, and you're traveling the world. And you get to see and experience different people and different cultures. And it really gives you that open view. The same thing happened after that article was the world opened up and I realized, man, addiction is not a race, not a color, not a religion, not an economics. It is a human issue, and we're all human beings, and it can impact anyone. So no, that's really been what part of this mission is when we started the coalition, We wanted to save lives. We wanted to bring a community together to work on this chronic, what we consider a chronic mental health condition that law enforcement alone cannot do. We were trying to change how we view and deal with it. But another part of that was the stigma. And I really took that to heart. And if I can use this uniform and my position as a police chief and tell you my experiences, what I've seen from all sides of this angle. And here's what I want you to do when you think about addiction or really any issue when we're talking about human beings, is I want you to struggle. If you struggle with that issue, that means you're open your mind. I had an opportunity to go down to DC, and I was with the DC coroner. We were getting ready to go on a Washington Post show. And he told me his life story. He goes, I grew up in a home where my parents made crack cocaine and sold it. These are my parents. I watched my parents get arrested. He goes, what do you think about that? I know you're an advocate for addiction. What do you think about that? And I was stunned. I was kind of like, I don't know what I think. I'm struggling with it. And he goes, stop. That's all I want you to do is struggle. He goes, if you struggle, that means you're having an open mind. And I took that to heart. And now when I talk to people, no matter what group I'm talking to, if I can get you just to struggle about your opinion and belief of addiction, then it opens up the mind. Now you can hear that there is a family that's impacted by it also, that the people who respond to those overdoses are impacted, that the first responders are impacted, that a community is impacted. And here's the thing, if you struggle, you're now opening the door to that vulnerability and empathy, which is a strength. And now you're starting to see the world from a different perspective. We get so focused on our own beliefs and opinions that we're not willing to hear somebody else's.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hear somebody else's, here's the thing, inhumanity is the answer. Because in humanity, I have empathy, vulnerability, and I'm willing to struggle. Now I can start finding the answers. Look, man, I don't agree with all this stuff. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. I struggle with my own opinions. A lot of people go, man, you went way over here. I've had all police officer friends who are no longer friends of mine, who your view of addiction is going to get cops hurt. We no longer want nothing to do with you. You're out of this. I'm outcasted in some realms, all because I opened up my mind. But my thing is if I open up that mind, maybe there's an answer there. Because I can tell you what we've been doing hasn't worked.
Yeah.
Right.
We've been doing it for what, 70 years?
Yeah.
People in jail for addiction, and we haven't solved it. I think the system itself is one of the biggest enablers of addiction, but it also comes back to now I got to reevaluate what I think about as a police officer, what my job is, and I also got to think about my Marine Corps days. What was the traditional stuff that I'm supposed to fall in line with? I don't have to give that up. I just got to expand it, is what I believe.
Absolutely. You talking about how there's the addict and then there's those attached to the addict. Right before we went live, Tom, I was sharing with you on Thanksgiving Day in 2018, my brother-in-law passed away from a heroin overdose. His name was Mac. He had 4 children. He was married. When he was sober, greatest guy ever. Smart, funny. Everyone loved him. He was a great human being. That human being had a disease that was so hard for him to let go of that he continually, you mentioned it, the thought of succeeding, the burden of success was almost too much. Every time things would start to go right or seem like they were starting to go right, he thought it would just be easier if I just messed up again. This is hard to do the right thing every day. And with addicts, with anybody, it's hard to do the right thing every day. But when you have this addiction that burns inside, it makes it even harder. And sadly, the addiction won at the end. But I can tell you firsthand that his struggle's now over. That burden has now been moved to everyone that he's touched. My wife, his sister, struggles almost every day. She has plenty of good days, but then there'll just be a day that's her brother. She grew up with this man. They knew each other better than anybody else in this world. My in-laws, they lost a child. My nieces and nephews. My one niece lives with me. My other young niece and other young nephew live with my in-laws, and the 4th child lives with his in-laws. So the children are now split up between 3 households, but we do our best to keep them engaged. We moved close to the in-laws, so the three younger ones could really stay engaged. As a matter of fact, those three young ones are in my house right now as we speak, doing the online learning. So we keep them together. But some of them were young to the point where they may not really remember their own father. And all they're going to remember him through is the stories that we can tell them. And the impact it has on so many other people is really the rough part of addiction, and the part that people don't think about on a regular basis. And so what you've done, creating these coalitions and doing the work to try to change that stigma a little bit from that's just an addict to, hey, this person has a medical and mental issue that we need to try to focus on is really the side I don't think too many people see. And so I want to thank you very much for that sort of thing.
Thanks for sharing the story. And it's really those stories that inspire me and the group to keep going. It's what gives us purpose so that no one's life was in vain. Everyone had purpose, and that purpose is continuing. That legacy is continuing because people share those stories. And I tell people it's easy to disregard the one, but it's not so easy to disregard the many. And if you looked at it from the many, from the family perspective, then you would start saying, wait a minute, this is a mother, father, brother, sister, son, or daughter that is struggling. That makes it different, because then, to what you guys said, Tim and Matt, you said this earlier, is how it impacts other people. Is now it could be me. I have a mother, sister, brother, father. It could be my family. And now we have something. There's that humanity. Now we can connect in that common. But something else you said is we've got to think about, it's never just the one. There's kids left behind. And you tell that story about having to talk about their father. One of the daughters, the oldest brother, had 5 kids, and his kids grew up without really knowing her father. So they would message me, what was my father like? And I could sit there and talk about all the negative experiences I had, but really I had just as many positive with them. I mean, sitting there on the porch talking to him, or he'd come by and say, hey, this is what's going on, giving him advice. He was a human being. He got wrapped up in the drugs. So it does impact everyone else. And I think if we understand that, then it helps us to get rid of some of that stigma. But look, man, none of this is easy. And again, I go back to that struggle, and it's probably one of the most profound words I've heard, and has become my mantra, is if I struggle with things, then I'll start looking at it from the human side. We can start finding some answers. And part of the answers is you talked about it, communicate. Whether you're a veteran, whether you're someone struggling with addiction, no matter what it is, there's a hole that you're trying to fill. And that communication, that human connection, is the most important thing. We learned it from addiction. COVID was one of the worst things that could have happened to addiction, because we learned it's that human to human contact. When you're talking about veteran suicide, someone threatened suicide, what's the first thing you do? You reach out and offer help, a human being.
Yeah.
How can we get away from humanity? It really is the answer to many of our ills. If we can look at it from the human side, there's a lot that we can help people with. But part of that is both of us on each side need to be a little bit vulnerable. And if we can open up and just tell people, man, I'm hurting right now. This is what I'm going through. Or, hey, man, I'm struggling with addiction. What can I do? Even if you don't have all the answers, just knowing someone's there, potentially looking for it, helps with that. And again, man, this is going to be my mantra through the whole thing, is struggle with these issues. If you struggle, I promise you'll find your humanity.
I think that these are lessons for, even beyond addiction, obviously. What you're saying is so relevant. It's so relevant right now. I think we were talking about this before, or maybe right when we went live. I've largely taken a step back from social media because of so much negativity, and it's on all sides, and it's very partisan, and it gets very ugly, and people get ugly, and their humanity is gone. And what happens is they start to dehumanize each other. And then we stop looking at each other like people and friends and family members, and we start looking at each other like, in this case, political pawns or something like that. And I think the same thing happens with addiction. And I'll admit firsthand, I have not largely been personally impacted, or at a very close level been impacted by addiction. And so I when you say struggle with it, I have struggled with it as well. And I think, some of the work that I do, it opens my mind anyway. Some of the work that I do professionally, it opens my mind anyway to see people differently, to open up and understand a little bit better. But admittedly, in my younger years and growing up, in my family, we never talked about this kind of stuff. There was no reference of this. And so you'd see somebody hobbling around in the shopping mall or something like that, and you'd be like, ew, and that was the reference. And I'm sure that that's probably a lot of people's reference. Again, it's to dehumanize this person that has a problem. And the same thing happens when we talk about the veteran suicide rates and things like that. I don't want to talk to this person. I can't offer them anything. Well, yes, you can. You can offer them some humanity. You can offer them some sort of guidance. You can offer them a place or a person to talk to. But I think about this from a personal standpoint, because I have been the one judging. And I am, Tom, you said earlier, or you asked earlier, are you willing to kind of put your sins out there for the world? Like, that's one of my things. I've been judgy. I have not always been the best person. I'm not a bad person, but I've judged, and I've been the stereotypical person in my younger years. So I want to ask a question though. You have testified before a Senate subcommittee on the subject. You've been in a number of different forums where you are the subject matter expert. Are we making progress? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it a marathon versus a sprint, which is probably an obvious question, but what kind of perspective do you have there?
Yeah, it's definitely a marathon. Think about this. We've been dealing with addiction for 100 some years, whether it was opium was a medicine or whether cocaine was a medicine. And probably one of the worst addictions out there that's legal is alcohol and cigarettes. Cigarettes have over a 90% recidivism rate. It kills hundreds of thousands of people. Millions around the world are impacted by smoking, and it trillions of dollars on the budget. But that's a legal addiction. And that's part of my thing is, how can this addiction be different than this one? Yeah, it's an illegal drug, but it still has the same impact, not only on the person, but the families and then the country and the world. But to get to your question, Matt, it is a marathon. There's pockets of progress. I don't like using the word success, because whenever you use the word success, people think it's automatically done. It's finished. It's not. And also, if we define success in parts, which is fine, I get that you got to have goals and you reach these goals in steps, but we got to think about it bigger. And how can we impact the most people? Overall, things aren't getting better. No. Are there pockets? Like, we will see, we're hoping, we're keeping our fingers crossed, the end numbers won't be out. And whenever I use the word number, never forget that that's a mother, father, brother, sister, son, or daughter. I'm only using that word for the data perspective of it only. We're hoping or keeping our fingers crossed that there'll be a 10% reduction in overdose deaths in our community. Nationwide, there will be an increase. And one of the biggest factors is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a killer. It's unlike any other drug. It cannot be compared to another drug, and it's spreading across the country. So I think as overall in the United States, we'll see an increase, but you'll see some pockets where there's coalitions, where there's groups working. They'll see small reductions, but you're still dealing with addiction overall. And, you're talking about this inauguration and a presidential change. And I don't care who's in the office. I don't care what you're Republican or Democrat. And I will say this from Nixon actually on, there's never been a president. And this is what my hope and my goal is. I'm hoping that in my lifetime, especially in my career, I see a president stand up on a podium and say, we will view addiction itself as the chronic mental medical condition it is, and we will treat it as such. I came close with Trump. I actually wrote him a letter. He wrote me a letter back. I was supposed to go speak with him. Melania, the first lady, ended up bumping me, which if you're going to get bumped, okay, I'll let the first lady bump me off the stage. I'm good with that.
Right.
But I had so much hope and faith, because he was the first one that came close. But what happens is there's still a base of stigma who won't let a politician get to that point because of whether there's financial parts of it, whether it's just the stigma, or like you're talking about, Matt, the judgment of, hey, look, you do heroin, that's a crime. You're automatically a criminal.
Right.
And what I'm saying is, what's the difference between heroin and alcohol? They both are substances, both get used for the same reason. One's legal, one's not. But I want a president to stand up and say, we're going to treat and view addiction differently. Now, I may be naive, and this is how much that, although I'm non-traditional, this is how much I believe in tradition. I believe a president can galvanize a country to end issues. Like going to the moon, curing polio, a vaccine for COVID-19, whether you agree with it or not. I don't care if you agree with any. The thing is, presidents have stood up and said, this is our mission as a country, and the country has come together, because that's what we do as Americans. And then we galvanize and we solve issues. I want a president, I don't care what letters in front of them, I want them to stand up and say, we're going to treat and view addiction differently. We're going to look at it as the chronic mental medical condition it is and take it out of the criminal justice system. Look, man, I'm a cop. My tools to deal with addiction, gun, taser, and handcuffs and jail. And it's funny you call me an expert, and it's one of the things that bothers me. I'm considered this worldwide expert on addiction. I have zero training in addiction. I didn't even go. I went to college once, and that was to speak with President Clinton at Johns Hopkins University. They didn't give me a degree. I got to walk in and speak. That was it. I have no degree in addiction. All I did was I saw the wrong and spoke up about it. Just think if a president did that, if a president stood up and we're going to change the way we view and deal with addiction, it would happen. And we would take it out of the criminal justice system and more into the healthcare system that deals with chronic conditions such as lung cancer, diabetes, alcoholism. All those other things get dealt with in the healthcare system, and we would have better opportunities and better chances for people to get through addiction, to be supported, to get into recovery. And even if you didn't get into recovery, we'd have better chances of keeping them alive. Mm-hmm. Think about cancer, smoking, alcohol. We keep people alive. And then if you're kept alive and it's long enough, there's more opportunities to get you into active recovery. You get into active recovery. Now, I don't care if you're conservative or liberal, it works out best for both, because if you can get an active recovery, you can get a job again. You can start getting a car, a house, and paying taxes again. Mm-hmm. If you're on the liberal side and you want to keep people alive, that is the ultimate in drug prevention. If you can get someone in recovery, now you're preventing that person from using. But from a law enforcement perspective, each person that gets in active recovery and doesn't use is a small, tiny droplet in reducing the drug supply coming into the country. Mm-hmm. Now, people will argue about supply and demand. I have my own view. I think supply actually dictates demand. If you don't, I think Starbucks, McDonald's, everyone, supply I'm on my 10th iPhone. I never asked for the first one. So I have this belief that supply dictates demand. But just think, if you got more people into recovery, we could reduce that demand. You're helping more people. So to me, it doesn't make sense why people are so hardened in their ideology that they can't struggle with this enough to be open to having this in the healthcare system and keeping people alive, getting them in recovery, getting them back on a job, getting them back to paying taxes, and reducing drug supply. I'm naive, I think.
You mentioned in your video being a naive child and thinking the cop is just going to arrest the bad guy, put him in jail, and the good people are all going to have happy little lives. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's not how it all works at the end of the day. But you mentioned about changing the overall public perspective of, if you use drugs, if you use what is deemed as an illegal substance, that is a crime. And, by law it is. But the reality is we've now flooded the jail systems with hundreds of thousands of non-violent offenders on drug charges when, as you've mentioned multiple times now, it's the mental medical condition that needs treated. You can't punish. You say this in your video. You can't punish addiction out of somebody. You can't send them away for 10 years, let them out and expect, hey, they're never going to do that again, because what the actual issue was not actually treated. But the actual issue was not actually dug in on, and nothing was actually fixed. You've thrown a Band-Aid over it and not allowed that person to have access to these same things. But now they're back. They have that access again. Guess what? They're going to go do it again. And the mental and medical side of it is truly, in my opinion, is truly what it is, because you have a feeling, a need. You need to do this. It's the mental side. You can do it. You just have to decide, hey, I can't continue to go down the same road. This continue to put everyone around me through this heartache and this pain as well. And believe me, if you put your mind to it, you can. So it is a mental addiction, and places that focus on those sort of things that get people, they take them and put them away where they're not able to have access, but then they also start to teach them about the mental side of it. I find that some of those places have more success.
Yeah, and Tim, you're bringing up something. This is, and Matt, you said it too. It's really bigger than addiction. And I think as a law enforcement officer, you're forcing humanity. Man, I've been there for people's births, birthdays, graduations. I've also been there for their deaths, their divorces, their loss of job. You get to see this whole spectrum of life. And I kind of go into policing a little bit different, and that I'm open in that you're right. I was naive. I thought I was Batman. I'd take people to jail, it'd all be fixed. But there's a point in every police officer's career when they take someone to jail and they come right back out and you're going, did that do any good? I'm not saying that we don't put people in jail. I'm not saying that we get rid of jail. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is question. You said it. I learned that laws aren't always, they may be illegal, but they may not always be morally wrong, or vice versa. What is morally wrong sometimes should be illegal, especially when you talk about politics and money and all the
Right.
business end of stuff. So it got convoluted somewhere along the line. And to me, I love that convoluted part because it makes the job more human. I get to experience more sides of it and be a cop and go to a shoplifting call and find out that if someone doesn't have a job and they need food. It changes your opinion. Be on that overdose and the family sitting there and the mother saying, don't let my child die. Be in a car crash and have a family so worried that their loved one is gone. And it makes you question, well, wait a minute, maybe just punishing isn't always the answer. Sometimes it is. It's kind of weird. Is I tell people we get upset about that person that overdoses 6 or 7 times, but I've been on a call. We had a murder here in Newtown, and the guy, both of them had already killed somebody. Why are we letting people who pull triggers and murder people even out of jail? I don't get that part.
Right.
They get out of jail, but you're pissed about the guy that overdosed 4 or 5
Right.
times. Our view is kind of mixed up. And I'm not saying one's right or wrong. All I'm saying is, again, go back to that struggle. I love the struggle in this job because it really has taught me life. Man, I am in a small town and I got to experience life like most people don't get to do. And not just my life, everyone else's life, but it really had such an impact on me personally. And I came to this town, like you said, Matt, thinking I could change the world. What I realized was the world changed me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty cool because it made me introspective and talk about judging. Look, man, we all judge. That's part of being a human being. You're worried about survival. How's this going to impact me personally? It's not a question of do you judge? It's a question of do you have enough self-awareness to realize that you're doing it and then open up the mind to struggle to see from another person's perspective. Man, I'm not sitting here saying as a cop, I question every law. Look, man, if you break the law, you hurt somebody, you do something wrong, there's consequences. That's what
Right.
life's about.
Yep.
What I'm saying is maybe that consequence, no matter if it's stealing, whatever it is, isn't always jail. Maybe there's a better way to do this. But if we're going to continue to go just punishing and it's a crime and then lock the keys and throw you away, it doesn't work. There's not enough room. So why don't we try to think of something new? And I think that convoluted view, that struggle allows for that, again, opportunity to open up and look at things differently and see if we can find some other solutions, actually fix the problem.
And I think that change comes with, like anything else, we think about this in business. When you want to change behaviors, you want to change culture, things like that, you educate and you educate and you educate. The problem is, and I think we're doing education again, Chief Synan, we can see you on YouTube. We can watch your TEDx. We can watch the Senate subcommittee testimony. We can watch this podcast or listen to this podcast and hear what you're saying. But are people seeking out that information? Do they want to learn? And I think that's where I joke around all the time that my son would rather watch adults making YouTube videos where they're crashing cars into walls and pranking people by, doing whatever they're doing in the streets versus looking at anything historical or from a civic standpoint, from learning about society. One of my big complaints is that in high school and sometimes college, as kids are growing up, we're not teaching them the nuts and bolts of life. People have no financial acumen, for example. Mm-hmm. They have no idea how taxes work. They have no idea how investments work. And perhaps this conversation, not addiction specifically, but maybe logical civics or how we treat people or humanity or something like that can be taught. And I don't know how we put that curriculum together, but it is it's one of those things that people have to be maybe force-fed through basic education in order to understand it. And this goes into a larger piece. I mean, I used to work in dispatch for the city of Cincinnati for 4.5 years. And one thing that I always thought about doing was creating a series of classes for elementary school students. So you get it in like 4th or 5th grade, kind of like sex ed class or something like that. It's 4th or 5th grade, and you get this course it tells you exactly how you call for emergency services, how the police work, how the fire department works. And all of that stuff would be just vitally important for people who have engagements with public services, law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. So I do have a question that I alluded to earlier, and it's getting off the topic of addiction real quick, but I want to know, obviously, first of all, I'm going to say with some humor that I think it's pretty apparent that nobody has seen Chief Tom Synan and Batman in the same room together. Not saying anything, just putting that out there. Tom, if you had to talk about if and I think you've put this on display through our conversation here, what would you want people, if you had to say one thing to the public about law enforcement officers, what is something that you would like a myth you'd like to dispel, or something you would say to people about you or people in your profession? And I mentioned this earlier, that oftentimes, if you don't know anybody who's a police officer personally or in law enforcement, there's this tough exterior because you're dealing with, in some cases, the worst that society has to offer. You're dealing with people's worst situations, car accidents, their houses burnt down, they've just been assaulted or robbed, or even worse. What's something that you would tell society about law enforcement officers that you'd really like to get across?
That we're human beings. I think you hit it on the head. This is just a shield, man. This is just my job. This allows me the opportunity to go into an issue and try to resolve it. But inside, we're human beings. And I'll work that both ways. It's not just from the public perspective, but I also think it's from internal, the law enforcement perspective. We need to remember that we're human beings. We're putting a shield on so we can go do a job. I'll tell you, back in the early 90s when I first started, 2 Cincinnati officers were shot and killed. Obviously a very emotional scene. The funeral was emotional. I'm sitting there crying, and I was dating a female cop at the time, and she wasn't crying. I was going, man, how can you do this? And she said, I've got my armor on. And that was pretty impactful, that she put her bulletproof vest on and this badge and this shield. And what it did in her mind, it didn't just protect her from harm, like a physical harm. It also protected her from emotional harm, which was powerful in that means then you're holding it in as a human being. And when you hold things in as a human being, now, like you guys talked about, I'm not communicating. Now that's starting to fester. I believe communication is really big, because when it comes out of your mouth, that means your brain thought of it. And now you can hear it and other people can analyze it. But by holding that in, and officers do this a lot, and you're right, Matt, it's a coping mechanism. And I used to do it too. You see the worst of life. You see these horrific things, just like you guys did in combat. You see these horrific things and you put this shield on. I think if both the public and we as law enforcement went on in this, and again, I'm going to go back to the humanity side, if we went into it as human beings and realizing that I'm a human being, when you view me, don't just see Chief, don't just see the badge, look at Tom. And every officer you come up with, don't look at that as Officer Jones or whoever it is. Look at that as human being, Mr. or Mrs. Jones. And then we can start finding some commonality. This badge, I tell, it's weird, because when I became chief, I was no longer Tom. You guys, my friends outside the world, call me Tom, but my name has changed and will be this forever. There's a group of people who will never recognize me as Tom. It will always be Chief. Yeah. And it really, I struggle with that identity when it first happened. I'm like, I'm still Tom. And someone said, no, you're not. You can't be both.
Right.
And I thought, think about the Marine Corps or the Army, military. Can you be both a human being and in the military? It's kind of this weird dynamic that we're saying you have to be two people. And I'm thinking, no, I'm still me. If you know me and you're a friend of mine, you know I'm goofy. I do this little stupid wave, have this stupid smile on my face. But I can also be the police chief. I can be both human and a chief. I believe you can both be a veteran and whatever profession you are, and a human being at the same time. So it's like I talked about in that TED Talk. It was really important at the end that I could lead with my uniform, my job, or I could lead with humanity. And that's what I think what I want people to realize is lead with your humanity. Have that humanity, resilience, understand grief, go through grief, in the end, you'll come out better. All because you started with that humanity. I'm a human being. My name's Tom Synan. It is not Chief Tom Synan. If I'm here at work, it's Chief Tom Synan, but they're both the same people.
Right.
I think you make a great point, and not just in your field, but any person in any sort of leadership role is if it's a uniform, if it's a military uniform, police uniform, if it's a title, you're a manager of some sort, an executive of some sort. You can lead with your title, you can lead with your uniform, and people will respect those things. They'll respect that uniform, they'll respect that title. But there are times, and that's that balancing act. You are chief, and you are also Tom. It's that balancing act between the two. You can be, the manager, but you're at the end of the day, you're also Matt or Tim or Bill, whoever you are. And so if someone comes to you with a real problem, it's probably time to drop that role, drop that title, drop that uniform, let that guard down. And that's where the empathy comes in. That's where the humanity comes in. And you're going to find that when you lead with the humanity and you lead with the empathy, you're going to get further in those sort of situations much, much better. And the road's going to be much, much smoother. And at the end of the day, once you've dealt with whatever that issue is in that way, you're going to find that respect is gained even more. And you make a great point by it's a balancing act. And for leaders in any role, if you find a good way to balance that, you're going to do better. You're going to succeed even more. And Matt, you brought something up earlier about how to possibly change and educate people on, hey, yes, by law, these people doing these illegal substances are committing a crime, but let's look at how we can actually treat this addiction. Let's treat this condition over just putting these people away. And really, we just need a government entity or someone with a bunch of money in their pockets, and we just kind of need to beat the public over the head with it. Essentially, that's the only way we're going to get to it. Putting together commercials. Remember the hey, this is your brain on drugs. Anyone from a certain age group will forever and always remember those commercials, right? Because they were just thrown and continuously beat into you. So if an ad campaign or a hit on 60 Minutes or the Today Show or something, one of these major national news platforms was put together, eventually I think the tide can turn. And as Chief has mentioned, he got so close with the outgoing president. Maybe the guy coming in today, maybe, Tom will have some better luck here. And it's just going to take that one person who can stand up in front of everyone and say, hey, we've been looking at it this way for so long. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we haven't seen the results we want. So we need to try to change let's try to go down a different road and see what kind of success we can find.
Dish 2028, that'll be the president to deal with.
Got my vote.
Okay, I don't know if I could ever go into politics.
I'm going to have to hear some more of your your stances. Yeah,
more rhetoric.
He's got good rhetoric.
Great rhetoric. I'll give you rhetoric all day long.
So yeah,
no, but I agree with everything, Tim. Everything that you just said. It is, and I remember the brain on drugs thing, and I think about, well, it's a little bit different. I think about the work that corporate America has done in terms of supporting veterans leaving active duty, just since it's on the top. And the purpose of our podcast has always been to take people who have served in the military and show what they're doing today, show the successes post-military, et cetera, et cetera. That's one of the big topics that we talk about are what's happening and what's not happening in that space. And it's all because corporate backers, and Tim, as you mentioned, money, people with money, if there's a financial outcome that is positive to people and they see it, people are willing to pay for stuff. I think in this case, and Tom, you mentioned this before, if you're taking X amount of people with addiction and putting them back into the workforce, that's X amount of taxes that are revived back into the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, while it costs money up front to maybe fix the issue, to deal with the issue, on the back end, you're creating more more revenue through productive members of society who maybe can't work right now. So follow the money, in other words.
Yeah, we're losing tens of billions, if not trillions of dollars on the front end from lost productivity and work. We're losing humanity and human beings because they don't feel like they have a purpose.
Right.
And if we were able to bring that back, man, it brings the whole community together. But, Tim, you're talking about something about stigma too. Think about this. Back in the 80s, it was HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. There was such a stigma with that. And there was these marketing groups who were trying to figure out how can we overcome the stigma. And what ended up happening was here comes Magic Johnson,
Yeah.
who people thought, well, no way can that person get
Right.
AIDS. To your point, Matt, people were funneled in on, well, this is the only group of people that gets HIV AIDS. And here comes Magic Johnson saying, I got it. Now everyone goes, well, wait a minute. If he got it, then I can get it.
Yeah.
But the other thing that he did was he humanized it.
Mhm.
He wasn't just, that was probably the time that you didn't look at Magic Johnson, the athlete. You looked at Magic Johnson, the human being, how it impacted him, how it impacted his family. And when Tom Petty died, when Prince died, I mean, many of us in this circle thought that was the moment. Not that you want that, you don't want anyone to die. But the thought was, here's this moment now, these bigger than life people who died from addiction. Maybe this will be the time that it changes the narrative. And it didn't happen. We have many of these discussions. How do we humanize it? And it's never lost on me that this uniform, for all the bad it does or what people may see me as, this is also good because it opens up a platform and we can have these discussions. But I'm not the one to take it to that level. It's got to be someone like you guys are talking about, that national level, a president, an athlete, someone who is able to galvanize and say, look, you thought this was the image of addiction. You thought this was the image of suicide. You thought this was the image of poverty. Here, I am that image. And when you look at me, I hope you see you. And when you do, now we can start overcoming that stigma. We're not there yet. Man, I'm just a small cog in this wheel. And if I can get this wheel spinning and someone else catches onto that wheel, and next thing you know, more and more people get on that wheel, and all of a sudden there's a bigger wheel who has more influence, they're the ones that'll be able to change it. But you guys are part of this wheel now too, to have this discussion, to be open to this and get it out to the public. Look, man, you hit it on the head, Matt. It is a marathon. And as long as I'm in this uniform, I will continue to talk about this and give this perspective. I am not saying I'm right. I know I'm wrong on a bunch of stuff, but all I'm saying is I'm open to struggle and looking for new ways to do this. And you guys are right. It's not just about addiction. It's changing my view on law enforcement. It's changing our view on society as human beings. None of it's easy conversations, but if we struggle with it, again, that vulnerability and empathy, we'll be able to find solutions. We haven't found it because we've been so steadfast in ideology instead of hearing someone else. Here's the biggest part of communication: listening.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
it's the hardest part.
That's the hardest part.
And to understanding what you're listening to. I think that's the.
Or if you don't, ask a question, man.
Right. Yeah.
You know, one of the hardest things to teach my cops is the word "I don't know."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even from a SWAT perspective as a team leader, and we would go do a raid, I'd go, if you don't know what you see, say it. Because now I know that you need other people up, and as a team, we can help. And when we help the one, we help the team. So a lot of this is, man, just saying, I don't know. I walk into meetings, I don't know. I'm considered this expert because I walk into meetings with these doctors and scientists and people with addiction, people who have lost family members. And the thing I always do is listen. And it's the strangest thing. I'm the expert now because I listen to you. When in reality, it's the people sitting at that table that are the real experts. But if you want to change, you want to make a change in your life as a person, in your family, in your society, and in your country, first thing is listen to somebody else. That'll make you an expert, and then you can start changing the world.
That's absolutely awesome. So we're getting ready to wrap up here. I just wanted to throw this out there, the National Addiction Hotline, in case anybody listening or someone you know may need this information. You can call 866-543-5083. That's the National Addiction Hotline. I know personally, I don't want to lose anyone else I care about to addiction. Tom, I'm sure your job would be a lot easier if you didn't have to deal with addiction and everything that involves addiction, including the sale of illegal substances. So, if you know somebody, get them help. And remember, it's not just that one person. There's countless individuals attached to that one person that's dealing with addiction. So you're trying to help the group, not the individual. So deal with humanity and deal with empathy. And that's really, I think, what we were trying to go for today. So, Chief, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been an amazing talk. It's been kind of a different type of episode, and that's good. It's one of the comments just came in, Chief. It's one of the best. Great show. So
there it is.
It is.
Thanks, Jason.
So,
hey, thanks you guys for bringing this up and allowing me to speak openly and lead with humanity.
Yeah, Tom, thanks so much for joining us. I look forward to, obviously we have you and I bump into each other from time to time. I'm going to bring my kiddo down to the department again and push the siren buttons again. And yeah,
And bring that card so I can put it up in my office.
Yeah, I will. I just need to get, you're not far away from me. I just need to get down there. I just haven't done it, but I've got the card. It's already made up. So, everybody else who's listening and watching, stay off the streets today. It's an important day in America. No matter which side you're on, let it do what it does. And thanks again, Tom, today for joining us with this great conversation.
Hey, thanks for being open, and thanks for the great conversation on your end, and thanks for bringing this topic up. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. As always, you can find us on all the social media platforms. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms. Give us a like, give us a follow, give us a rating and review. That helps us get into the eyes and the ears of other listeners, and especially with a topic like today. The more people that see and hear these things, the more people are going to start to struggle, and that's when the minds open up and we can start to make change. So, and that's really the focus. So go out there, share this with somebody, tell one friend about it, and tell them to tell a friend about it as well. So we appreciate everybody checking us out. Until next time, you'll see us here next week on Beyond the Wire.